that's an interesting question about, I guess, sensitive topics, traumatic topics, and even sort of secondhand trauma that the interviewer experiences, what some people call secondhand trauma, or compassion fatigue, or the stresses for the interviewer. There's an enormous literature on this that I've been dealing with. Later, I could have to go to my bibliography to provide lots and lots of citations. For an online setting, I don't know I mean, certainly there might be kinds of emotion that are conveyed in an in-person setting that you experience being in a room with someone, that might be different. Clearly I'm doing these life history interviews where displaced Syrians are talking about their lives. I do open-ended interviews in that I do not have questions at all. It's a very particular research project, and I appreciate that many of you do not have the luxury of just having a conversation with someone and saying, tell me anything you want, and I'm going to learn from it, and I'm not going to ask you any questions. Most of you will not have such research designs. I've deliberately chosen a very open research design because I don't want to ask these folks pointed questions. I know that simply hearing a question can be triggering. And I've always used this sort of philosophy in this project where someone, I say, just tell me about yourself, and figure that person will go in whatever direction they prefer. And I'm sort of along for the ride, and hoping in that sense that if there are particularly traumatizing or painful topics that a person does not want to talk about, they will not raise them. I will not even know about them. They won't come up, and will stay in what feels like relatively safe ground for the interviewee. Of course, there are a million ways in which you diverge into less safe territory, because once someone's talking, they can say things that they then later regret talking, or it goes to painful territory. I would say there also that just because a topic is painful for the interviewee doesn't necessarily mean that interviewee doesn't want to talk about them. Sometimes there can be a kind of catharsis or relief or feeling of solace in talking about painful topics. I've definitely done interviews where someone feels like they want to talk about what's painful because they want to make sense of it themselves. They want to, it brings experiences to a level of consciousness to think about it, to articulate it. I've had people say, I decided to do this interview with you today because I want to talk about this thing, because every time I do, I feel like there are new layers of understanding, and I want to understand what happened to me. So something could be very painful, but still the interviewee wants to, whether they want to speak truth to power and have their experience documented, or they want to understand it for themselves. So but all of that, I realize, is aside to the question about what does it mean for us as an interviewer to experience that kind of pain. Yeah, I don't know if it's, as I said, there might be sort of emotional cues and an emotional intensity and feeling and mood that you get in person that you don't get online. But for me, there has been this kind of intimacy of like locked eye to eye. The rest of the world pauses. You're outside time and space, and you are zooming into a person's words. That does have a kind of emotional intensity too, that might surprise that might surprise you, and I have to say probably it surprised me, where I assumed an online setting would be necessarily distanced, artificial, feel like it there was something fake about it because you're looking at a screen and you're in your own house. So I would say in that sense, I don't know if it's more or less, secondhand trauma, but I would say be prepared to not go in thinking that the emotions of the experience will be lesser, and they could be amplified because of this a kind of one-to-one connection, which again, I would say I did not expect, but that I did find in online. So to be prepared for it, and to go at a pace that is comfortable to yourself, to not schedule 4 interviews in a day if they're going to be exhausting in many ways. The simple task of this active, sympathetic, empathetic listening is physically and mentally and emotionally tiring. So to pace yourself for that, and expect it if you feel that way, and and give yourself that space, because maybe in an in-person environment you have that space of, you go to somebody's house and then you have the time when you're leaving you're walking back to wherever you're staying, or you're taking a taxi to think on the way home, or there's some sort of built-in breaks in the sheer transportation of going to a place and coming back from a place, that will be different when you press leave meeting and then you are just, you know, sitting in your living room, to maybe to work in that space, to debrief, to reflect, to breathe, that you have to sort of consciously, deliberately work into the system to protect your own emotions. So I'm sort of thinking out loud there, but I really appreciate the question.
Yeah, I agree. I also found debriefing very useful after, because it's weird that, you know, when you finish an interview and then you find yourself sitting at home, right, or in your office, debriefing helps, and also don't schedule interviews back to back. You will need that space. But I was also thinking, you know, there are new types of second trauma that might emerge, like, for example, when you're talking to someone about something sensitive, or when you feel, you know, you can feel the emotions, and for example, power cut and you lose them online, it leaves you there. On the other hand, you know, not knowing exactly what happened, why did they disappear, did they, you know, it's also easy for people to leave the interview, you know, just turn off their computers and leave. So there are maybe situations that we will have to go through where, you know, if you're talking to someone in a war zone and, you know, and then they lose connection. So yes, it can decrease sometimes secondhand trauma, but in other cases, I guess it will increase that kind of, and this is, again, we will be learning more as we do this more online, but yeah, or, you know, someone screaming at home and you not knowing what to do. And I think also it depends on the personality and the character of the interviewer. Some people are very good with, you know, face-to-face, the body language, you know, some people are able to do this, and other people are more comfortable with, you know, a mediated way of communication online. So I expect that it differs a bit from one person to the other, but I think there are those settings where there will be new types of traumas that we will have to deal with or experience. And yeah, it's interesting for us to start thinking about it now. Okay, someone is asking about how do we deal with, so Nasreen is asking about how do we deal with unexpected incidental findings of criminal activity. I think, yeah, I mean, we also do this with in-person interviews, right? So I think we need to follow the same procedure of, so again, they're different. I mean, we deal with each one differently. So criminal activity or self-harm are not exactly the same. But if someone is giving you information that is not criminal information, right? So I'll give you an example from my research when I was interviewing people who participated in the Civil War. So sometimes they would start, and it's not necessarily always correct, right? They might just be making up stories sometimes because it's gendered, because they want to, you know, impress, or they want to give you a specific story. I mean, I remember one interview where around 40 minutes in, the interviewee tells me, so I've started asking basic questions about how many kids do you have, family background, where do you live, etc. And 40 minutes later, he tells me, do you really want to know what happened? Because I started asking questions that were very specific to a battle, and he figured that I knew some details. So he said, okay, do you really want to know? Turn off your recorder. And we started again. And then I discovered that he gave me wrong information all through. He told me that he has, for example, 4 kids, he had 3. he told me that he lived in another street, in the same neighborhood, but another street. And then he told me, I'm a militiaman, I'm someone who works with those things. You think you're smarter than me. Of course, I'll give you wrong information. So this is when it takes time to build that connection. And, sometimes you're not sure, but if people, and during that interview, he was telling me about how, he was chopping people's ears off and etc. And I don't know, and I don't think this is something that really happened, but I had to stop him at some places and tell him, I'm more interested in that other side, because I don't want to know about criminal activities that I would have to report. But if someone, if you feel that there is a potential of self-harm, or someone is struggling with some sorts of psychological or mental health, usually we do. You need to, if you can, of course, if you know the context, the country, phone numbers of people who can help, and associations, organizations, etc. But yeah, there's a lot of literature on how to deal with those different cases, and maybe Wendy can say a bit more. But I've found this question of criminal activity because it was one of the things I had to deal with, and sometimes it's difficult to stop them, but it's also important not to collect information that we don't need. If this is information that you need, this is another. This is a completely other story that you will have to clear with IRB, and again, depending on the context.
Yeah, I would just say, Nassim, I really appreciate your question, because one thing that occurs to me is that one of the advantages was to discuss about online interviews is that you can jump from place to place and go places that you haven't necessarily been in person, and go to different places, which I think your question raises a really great caveat or concern about, is that if you are doing research grounded in one place, the traditional way of doing field work, and you get to know people, and you get to know services, and you get to know systems, and you get to know who to talk to, should different crises arrive, because you spend time there, that you are probably better equipped to have to know who to go to if these things result. And if you are jumping, as I have done, from doing an interview in Japan and one day, in Brazil and the next, and Chile the other, I don't know those networks in each of those places. So this, your question is showing me that I have not been prepared necessarily, that if I were to hear something of that sort in those interviews, I don't know where for this person, tens of thousands of miles away, where to go, because I'm seeing that person kind of outside a social context, and I'm outside their social context. So that just leads me to think that we need to prepare for those, and that that issue is just something to keep in mind, in a way that might be different if you really are grounded in a community doing field work. Your networks are different. So I appreciate that. So I think it's just a really important thing to keep in mind.